Phillies and Genlicles, I hope you're happy for making me read this damn story, but this is another edition of Pony Fiction Theater. I'm your host, Nate. I'm going to be your narrator. With me is John as usual. He'll be spectating.
Hi.
And probably gagging because of the content of the story.
Oh, I will not gag. I will actually be very thrilled. Just cupcakes. Remember cupcakes.
Oh my god. Anyways, this story has a warning. It says the following story contains explicit sexual content or gore. Read at your own risk.
You never said anything about sexual content. I
did not know that, but I heard it's very, very bad. From what people tell me, this is worse than cupcakes. And we'll see.
That's really funny.
This story is called Sweet Apple Massacre, and it's made by Big Macintosh 20111.
Oh, mine is going to be just as bad.
And read at your own risk, folks, the viewers of this video. The link is in the description. But I warn you, this story is not for the faint of heart. Anyways, let's begin. Big Macintosh surveyed the many apple trees that made up Sweet Apple Acres. It was nearly apple buck season once again, and it looked like it though they would having a bumper harvest this year. He nodded, satisfied. His sister Applejack walked up beside him. "Woo, boy, howdy! I'm sure glad you ain't injured this time, Big Macintosh," she said. "Why, there are even more apples on them trees than last year." "Yup," Big Macintosh replied, in his characteristic manner. "Them's a lot of apples." Applejack was silent for a moment, enjoying the feel of the slight breeze against her blonde mane. "Say, I don't suppose you've seen Apple Bloom anywhere, have you? I've been looking for her all day, and she ain't nowhere to be found." Big Macintosh shook his head. "Sorry, sis, I can't say I have." "Darn, that silly filly's gonna have probably gone off somewhere with her friends. I just hope she ain't getting herself into any mischief, or else there's gonna be hay to pay." "Don't you go worried about yourself, Applejack," he replied. "I'm sure she's perfectly fine. But anyway, I need to go back into the barn. I gotta go press some apples for some of the home-brewed apple cider. I hoof-picked a few apples earlier, especially, all nice and plump and ripe. And they ain't gonna press themselves." Applejack laughed. "You sure do love your cider, don't you? Just make sure Apple Bloom don't get hers hooves on it again. We all know what happened last time." Big Macintosh chuckled along with his sister. "Yup." The large red pony trotted back to the barn and gently closed the door. He opened the trap door with his mouth and went down to the steps into an old disused apple cellar. Usually it was just filled with junk, scrap metal, old worn-out plows, old rope, and various other bits and bobs that had outlived their usefulness. Big Macintosh often came down here when he wanted to get away from the world, to withdraw for a little while for some peace and quiet. Today was different, however. The old rope at least had found a new use. Because in the cellar space were Apple Bloom and her fellow cutie marker satyrs, Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo, bound and gagged, propped up against the wall. 3 pairs of scared round eyes looked up at Big Macintosh as he approached. "Now then, three little Philly." Oh my, and he's already gone. Now then.
That's awesome. Go on, please.
"Now then, ya 3 fillies," he said, as placid as ever. "Y'all need to learn a lesson. You need to learn not to mess around with Big Macintosh. All I want is some peace and quiet," he said, looking directly at Apple Bloom. The little red-haired filly cowered under his gaze. "All I want is a quiet life, without you cutie microstaters running around the place, making with the noise. When I'm finished with y'all, there's gonna be no noise from you ever again." As Big Macintosh approached, Scootaloo flapped her wings, struggling to get off the ground. Big Macintosh laughed and grabbed one of her wings. He twisted, at first slow, watching the pain visibly grow in her eyes, but then tore hard, smiling slightly when he heard the snap of the muffled whimper that came from Scootaloo. He then threw her to the ground. "Your wings are useless, you silly filly," he said pleasantly. He then went to the toolbox and took out a rusty knife with a jagged blade and dropped it in front of the 3 fillies. "I'm gonna take off those gags now," he said. "The first one of you to scream gets their tongues cut out." He took off Sweetie Belle's gag first. She looked up at him with terror, but managed to stay quiet. Next was Scootaloo. She let out a strangled whine and was breathing heavily, still in horrendous pain from her broken wing, but managed to resist the temptation. Finally, he removed the gag from her sister, Apple Bloom. She stared at him with large round eyes, filled with fear and incomprehension. This was Big Macintosh, after all. Her big brother, and the gentlest of souls, wasn't he? Surely this was just a horrible joke. But she had seen what she had done to Scootaloo's wing, and this was definitely no joke. She took a deep breath. Applejack! Big Macintosh shoved a hoof in Applejack's mouth, silencing her scream. He sighed and shook his head. I told you not to scream, Applejack. You should listen to your big bro. I'll scream and scream again, and Applejack will hear and Applejack said falteringly, you know, I kinda hope you do, after all. I still ain't forgiven Applejack for that injury she gave me last Applebuck season. If you want Applejack to join it all down here, scream away. I, for one, would welcome her company. But now, to business. Big Macintosh picked up the knife. Oh, no. And loomed over to the cowering Apple Bloom. She pinned her down with a powerful hoof, and then stuck the knife into Apple Bloom's mouth. Sweetie Belle vomited at the sight. At the thick yellow chunks and an acidic smelling liquid splattering heavily on the floor. Scootaloo managed not to be sick, but rather gasped and sobbed and choked with panic. Big Macintosh forced open Apple Bloom's mouth and with some effort cut out her tongue. Apple Bloom tried to scream, but with her mouth was too full of blood, so it was more of a muted gurgle. After a short while, she collapsed, tears streaming from her eyes, falling unconscious from the shock and the pain. Big Macintosh then took the tongue and rolled in a puddle of putrid vomit on the floor. He smiled at Scootaloo. You hungry? Scootaloo shook her head vigorously and cast him a defiant glare. If Rainbow Dash was here, she would kick the crap out of you maniac. Big Macintosh shrugged. Well, she ain't. Anyway, I wouldn't be so sure about that. Rainbow Dash ain't as tough as she likes to make out. He then shoved the vomit-covered tongue into Scootaloo's mouth. Then he used his hoof to clamp her mouth shut. Don't you go trying to spit it out now, he said calmly. The little laughed, and the filly struggled and squirmed. Didn't your mother ever tell you how important it is to chew your food? Scootaloo closed her eyes and flapped one good wing desperately, eventually swallowing Apple Bloom's tongue. Big Macintosh, still holding the writhing Scootaloo down with his strong hooves, then mounted the orange filly and slid his penis into their tight virgin pussy. Jesus Christ. Raping her for several minutes while Sweetie Belle watched, trembling with revulsion. Apple Bloom was still out cold, blood pouring out of her torn-up mouth. Cutie Mark Crusader rape victims, Big Macintosh said, with tender mockery, as he fucked Scootaloo, followed by a gentle chuckle. Guess you all found your purpose in life now. Now your special talent is getting raped. Yup. Eventually, he withdrew from Scootaloo and gripped her head tight and repeatedly punched her hard with a hoof in the face, causing her nose to shatter and spurt with blood. He scooped up some of the blood and some of Sweetie Belle's vomit with his tongue and held it in his mouth so that it mixed with his saliva. And then he brought his mouth close to Scootaloo's and spat the rank mixture into her mouth. He clamped his hoof over her mouth and held her nose until she gagged and eventually had no choice but to swallow. As Scootaloo reached and spat and cried, spat and cried, he turned to Sweetie Belle. He grabbed her easily, and she was too shocked and traumatized to respond. And with apparent amusement, he rammed her horn up Scootaloo's ass. The horn was too big and hard, so the skin around Scootaloo's ass ripped, and blood and fecal matter just first trickled and then poured profusely down into Sweetie Belle's face, as well as urine as Scootaloo pissed herself.
Ew.
You keep doing that, Sweetie Belle, he said. The unicorn carried on, pushing her horn up Scootaloo's anus, slowly but surely. Her normally well-groomed pink and purple mane was now stained a reddish brown, glistening with the wetness of the piss and blood. If you stop, I'll come over here and get creative. I may seem a bit dense, but quite a creative stallion, you know," Big Macintosh said with a wink. "Yup." He went into Apple Bloom and penetrated his little sister's unconscious body with his hard cock. While he violated her, he got another knife, this one sharp and shiny, and sliced open her flank, causing her glistening intestines to flop out wetly onto the floor. He glanced over and was pleased to see that Sweetie Belle was still using her horn to anally penetrate Scootaloo, and her face was now completely covered in blood and feces and urine. He turned his attention to Apple Bloom and scooped up her crimson entrails and wrapped them around her neck. Still fucking the filly? With his front hooves, he pulled until he was wrapped so tightly around Apple Bloom's neck that it broke her windpipe. She was now surely dead. But Big Macintosh continued fucking until her body began to lose from form and collapse into a quivering, amorphous mass of fur and blood and flesh. The perineum had fallen away, leaving a single red and raw gaping void. He carried on until he was fucking nothing but a single swollen and bloody orifice, and then discarded his baby sister's carcass as though she were nothing more than a rotten apple core. He then took the knife and grabbed Sweetie Belle's and tossed her aside. He forced himself into Scootaloo's ruined anus, and then took the knife and cut from her ass in a sweeping motion up to her belly, and all her innards fell out. He then grabbed her head, twisted it, and tore it clean off, using his immense strength, and fucked it in the mouth, and then tossed it aside. He then had sex with her headless body, both in the vagina and the ass, until he got bored. Yup. Sweetie Belle was the last remaining Crusader. She was herself barely conscious, overcome with the nauseating stench of blood, shit, piss, and that covered her horn and her face. Big Macintosh pinned Sweetie Belle down with his hoof and plunged the knife into her green eye, and twisted, causing virtuous fluid to dribble out into the handle. With that, Sweetie Belle let out a throaty whine and involuntarily emptied her bowels. And the aroma of flesh, urine, and feces filled the apple cellar once again. He withdrew the knife and did the same to the other eye, each time holding her tight and sticking his hoof into her mouth to silence her agonized screams. He licked the vitreous fluid that leaked onto the knife, and then methodically began cutting and hacking at her front left hoof using the rusty knife. The knife was quite blunt, so it took a Herculean effort to get through the skin, bone, and cartilage, but eventually the bone splintered and the leg came off. He did the same to the other legs, until all four were amputated and nothing remained but bloody stumps, with slamming white ligament and broken bone shards hanging out. At some point, Sweetie Belle had passed out. The overwhelming pain too much for her to bear. He then used the knife to gouge out her left eye and jammed his penis into her eye socket, penetrating repeatedly deep into her brain, enjoying how tight her skull felt around his hard shaft, and how warm and squishy the brain matter felt against the tip of his throbbing penis. As he twisted Sweetie Belle's neck. After he had finished skull fucking her, he cracked open her skull with a swift stamp of the hoof, and then bent down and ate some of her exposed brain, taking care to spit out a few fragments of skull bone that got mixed in as he chewed. And we're gonna continue this in part 2. God.